here's some things I want you to know about Macbeth. First, I want you to know that Macbeth is the shortest play that Shakespeare wrote. And he wrote this play for a very specific purpose. He had already written some big plays. He'd written Hamlet already. He was already well into his career. He was already famous. But here's what happened to Shakespeare at the time and why he wrote Macbeth. It's like you're at work and you have a boss, and that boss leaves, quits, gets promoted, but is gone. And everything has been just fine, and everything's running along just fine. And some people are sort of slack, and you're comfortable, and all of a sudden now you get a new boss. And you've got to change how you behave, because a new boss is going to have different expectations. And everybody shakes it up a little bit and gets now on time and dresses. They're a little bit more concerned about what they wear, and all those kinds of things change. Well, that's what happened to William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was born in 1564 in Stratford-Avon in England, and you can look up his history. You've probably already studied his history when you read Julius Caesar or Romeo and Juliet in 9th or 10th grade. But in midstream of his career, where he was in good with the Queen, and that was Queen Elizabeth I. She loved drama. She loved going to the theater. She loved the plays that Shakespeare wrote. And in fact, she was a patron of Shakespeare's. And so through one of her lords, he had an acting company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Well, when Queen Elizabeth died, things changed. There's a new boss. And back in those days, they didn't even know from week to week if they would even be able to have the dramas continue, because the Puritans were rising and getting more and more powerful, and those are the same people who eventually left England to come to this country because they were fed up with everything that was going on. But one of the things that they strongly believed was that if you acted in plays, or in other words, you tried to become someone that you are not, then that was sacrilegious. That was a sin. And so they were always trying to shut down the theaters. Well, here's Shakespeare. There's a new king, actually. Remember, Elizabeth never married. She never had any children. And she really never even named an heir until on her deathbed she named her cousin James. She really didn't even want to do that. But there was nobody else, and she was pressured to do it. James was the king of Scotland. The English people always had disdain for Scotland. All during that time, in Braveheart, you saw it. If you watched any of those movies, England and Scotland were always fighting. The Scottish people always hated the English. The English were always trying to take over Scotland. Scotland was considered barbaric. They painted their faces blue back in an old Druid custom when they were fighting. They did all kinds of strange things. They wore kilts, and they lived in a far more barbaric, what the English would think. The English were all puffed up and dandy and fancy already, and they felt like the Scots were just much lower. Well, the only one that was there, only person of royalty that had any relation to the throne of England, was James. He was James VI of Scotland. He was Elizabeth's cousin. So on her deathbed, she named him King of England. Well, this was interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that here they'd fought for several hundred years, England and Scotland. And in one fell swoop, Scotland becomes part of England, England becomes part of Scotland, they come together, and there was not a gun fired or a shot or any kind of a war. It just happened in that one succession of the monarchy. And because James was the first James of England, and because England had more power than Scotland, his number changed. So he's now James the First of England, because that's the way queens and kings are named. So right now, do you know who is the monarch of England? No? There's a Queen Elizabeth on the throne in England right now. She's considered Queen Elizabeth II because she is the second queen with the name of Elizabeth to be there. So it doesn't matter how many hundreds of years, or 400 years between Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II, but she's just the second Elizabeth to be queen. Well, James was the first James to be king. Even though he was the sixth James when he was in Scotland, he was the first one in England. England trumps Scotland. So he becomes James the First of England. New boss. Well, Shakespeare knew several things about James. One, he knew that James was from Scotland. And so he would have a passion for Scotland. In fact, he would be an aficionado of all things Scottish because he's from Scotland. 2, Shakespeare knew that James was a little obsessed with witchcraft. Actually, will you close the door for me, Frank? So he knew that he was a little obsessed with witchcraft because he'd written a book. James had written a book about witchcraft. And so Shakespeare knew that. Shakespeare also knew that James was very religious. And in fact, James had, as one of his first acts, he had a copy of the Bible translated into English so that the people could read it. Now, up until this time, it had been back and forth, and I hope you've studied this. If not, tell me so, and I'll do another one of these little mini things, because this is a fascinating period of history in religion. But it had been Protestant, then it had been Catholic, and then it had been Protestant and been Catholic, and all of that. At this point now, Elizabeth was Protestant. When she passed it to James, it stayed that way. James had the Bible translated into English. It was not the first translation. It was the second translation that was made available. But it was the one that was most commonly produced and given to the people. In fact, when people moved from England to America, and the big large waves of people at this time in the 1600s, when they were populating our country, the 2 books that they brought with them would be a copy of the King James Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare. That's why Shakespeare is so entrenched in our culture, and it's why the Bible is so entrenched in our culture, and so much of our literature has biblical allusions. And that is the King James Bible that you know of today. So when people walk around saying, thou, or praying with, O Lord, thou wouldst, whatever, I wish thine enemy, and they're using these and thines and wouldst and couldst and all that kind of stuff, I laugh a little inside my head because I know they're not speaking anything that's biblical. They're speaking the language of King James, and that was Elizabethan England in the 1600s, so they're speaking just a translation of the English as it was spoken in Shakespeare's time. And that's why Shakespeare's language sounds so much like the King James Bible, which is not read as much today as it used to be. So, that brings us to William Shakespeare. So, he's got a new boss. He knows he's obsessed with witches. And he knows that he is from Scotland. And he knows that he's religious. Now, if you have a new boss, and you don't know if he likes drama or not, you don't know if he's going to support the plays or not, you don't know if he's going to support the theater or shut it down, but you're told to write a play to entertain him. Pretty smart on Mr. Shakespeare's part to set it in Scotland, open it with witches, and make it about good and evil. It's also pretty smart to make it the shortest play that you write, because he doesn't know what kind of a audience James is going to be. And so a short play would guarantee his success. Now there's one other little tidbit that's interesting. Shakespeare puts in the play of Macbeth, he twists history a good bit in this. And if you go to my website, you'll see a link where you can go and read the true story of Macbeth. And it is different. Shakespeare does mess with it. But the character of Banquo is actually related to King James. And so when Banquo is in this play, and early on in the play, the witches tell Banquo, your children will be kings, but you will not be a king. James would be sitting in that audience going, that's me. Because Banquo is one of my ancestors. So Shakespeare wrote this in the late 1500s, early 1600s, but it takes place in about 1100. Same time as Braveheart, really, in that same time period. So James would be able to say, Banquo, that's one of my ancestors. So I'm in this play. So you see how clever Shakespeare was? Mm-hmm. Scotland, witches, good and evil, a character in the play that is directly connected to James, the shortest play of all. Really, really smart on Shakespeare's part.